Welcome to Chapter 7 of Integrated Activism. These are a set of slideshows that explain the chapters of my book, Integrated Activism, in slideshow format. Chapter 7 is called Why Large Groups of Intelligent People Do Foolish Things. It's a profound question that we can build space shuttles that go into outer space. We can send people to the moon. We can build all sorts of computers, and we've certainly had extraordinary advances in many realms of mechanical technology, medical technology, and yet in other social realms concerning sustainability, the environment, class division, we haven't progressed. We have regressed. So why are we so smart in some ways and so foolish in other ways? And I think a lot of people assume it's just a human foible. That's just the way we are. That's our human nature. Or I don't think any of that's true. I believe that human cultures are highly integrated systems, and that understanding how those systems work, understanding how our own human culture evolves, why it evolves, how it evolves, is critically important to our own survival. As much as we know about science, we don't have a science of culture, basically because we don't want one, because it is too disruptive. But understanding the processes by which we learn to know some things and not know other things, I think is critically important, and I think it explains why our culture is not more socially intelligent. That which unifies makes us strong, that which unifies makes us blind. That's, in as small of a nutshell as I can make it, the conundrum that humanity has faced for at least the last 10,000 years of needing to form unified, stratified, powerful groups to fight other unified, stratified, powerful groups, and in the process becoming blind to their own cultural evolution. So let's go through here and see how and why that's done. In the social realm, every human culture knows what it chooses to know and does not know what it chooses to not know. Cultural dissonance, the disjuncture between the ideal and the real. Cultural dissonance is my term, at least as far as I know. Haven't seen it used anywhere else. It's my term for psychological dissonance writ on a large scale. Psychological dissonance is when we think we are a particular way morally, or we just think things should be a certain way, and then reality doesn't conform to our preconceptions, and it creates a dissonance. And often people will create rationalizations to cover up that dissonance, and that happens on a social level, on a broad level, in every human culture. The issues that tend to bring that up most predictably are war. Every human culture, every human group tends to see itself as being benign, strong, right in the eyes of their spirits or deities, and yet when one goes to war, it is the antithesis of morality, the antithesis of so much of our preconceptions. So war generates quite a bit of cultural dissonance, and that is glossed over by great rationalizations about warfare, or about the inhuman nature of the enemy. The other thing that generates dissonance in our time is class division. The fact that we have some people who are so wealthy and live in a very technologically sophisticated world, and other people who live on the street. We choose to not know what causes poverty. We choose to not understand what drives the class divisions in our society, because it makes us uncomfortable. And that choosing to not know has implications on people's lives, but it also has a broader implication on our own social evolution, because if we choose to not know too many things, then we have effectively chosen to not understand the evolution of human culture, which I think is the case. So we can look at particular ways in which we choose to not know, but these different ways kind of come together. It's actually Richard Wilkinson's book, Poverty in Progress, which I've talked about before, which brings up the issue of complementary technologies. So in order to have a gasoline engine, you have to have the precursor to the gasoline engine was enough understanding of electricity to create a spark plug, enough understanding of metallurgy to create the metallic parts of a gasoline engine. So technologies cannot evolve in isolation. They have to evolve in connection with each other. So in the social realm, when we have dissonance around warfare, pre-industrial cultures always had dissonance around a great deal of cultural dissonance around infanticide. We have an enormous amount of cultural dissonance around class division and around imperialism, around the economic relationship between the powerful industrial nations and the less powerful nations. And vested interest is another way to look at something that generates dissonance or causes a suppression of complementary technologies. So things like tobacco, we know, generate a great deal of money. Oil generates a great deal of money. And the various vested interests, tobacco interest, oil interest, coal interest, pursue various public campaigns, disinformation campaigns, which you see now with climate change. And you can point a finger at a particular action or set of actions on the part of these vested interests and condemn it as it should be condemned. But again, it's this suppression of a set of complementary technologies that would allow us to understand human evolution. If we can't understand warfare, if we can't understand witch hunting, if we can't understand class division, if we're not allowed to understand tobacco and oil and environmental sustainability, the whole edifice, all the pieces we would need to put together an understanding of human cultural evolution falls apart. We are left in the dark. Sustainability is another big source of cultural dissonance. I think I've said that already, but clearly, the fact that industrial civilization is changing so rapidly and is fundamentally unstable because of that rapid change, enormous dissonance there, and something we don't want to talk about, something you don't hear talked about in the news. The how we generate selective cultural unawareness, I think, is important, because if we know how, then we know how potentially to generate cultural awareness. Because if we're really we're taking a lot of shortcuts, we're doing what we have to do politically, I suppose, but our social movements are not geared toward the long term in terms of understanding cultural evolution and having a long-term plan of how to address the whole issue of why we are stupid on purpose, basically. And I think the primary means of how we generate conformity, how we generate adherence to social norms in large-scale societies at the expense of social intelligence, is through the manipulation of childhood cognitive development. And it's not an ideological question of simply teaching children to be patriotic or to fear this or worship that or whatever. It's deeper and more fundamental than that. It's an actual manipulation of how people think, not what they think or in addition to what they think, but how people think. It's a very systematic process. And again, human cultures are not, they're very integrated, very complex. And you see that when you look at all these cultures around the world and the various enormously complicated and intricate ways they develop adapting to their environments. In a socially stratified world, primary driving force of that adaptation is toward dealing with other stratified groups. So if you look at it cross-culturally, if you look at childrearing cross-culturally, one consistent pattern that jumps out between pre-industrial and industrial cultures is that in pre-industrial cultures, among gatherers or other village-level cultures, particularly the smaller ones, youth assume adult roles early. There are no rigid childhood educational systems. And you have to keep in mind that these are the social structures in which human beings evolved, inasmuch as our modern culture is based on previously established biological patterns. Those patterns were set in place in hunting and gathering cultures. And in those cultures, adults, young children, not young children, but certainly young, what we would call young adults, teenagers, move into adult roles very seamlessly. There's not the kind of structuring of childhood that we have in our own society. You see children doing all sorts of things that never be allowed to do in our society in these smaller village-level cultures or band-level cultures, and that's quite consistent. That's not one particular group that's way. Every group, every pre-industrial group that I've ever looked at, that's quite consistent. So what happened as the world became more crowded, humans moved to every corner of the world to try to get away from the crowding, and eventually there's no place left to move, and people had to start shifting to agriculture and intensifying production within a given spot and fighting their neighbors. Warfare all over the world or in different places at different times began to increase. I love this quote. This is from a Marvin Harris book because it gives you a sense of what tribal level chiefs, what their goal is. the Marvin Harris and other anthropologists have referred to them as intensifiers of production. I think they're both intensifiers and unifiers, or intensifiers of effort, not just for production but for warfare. So this is a quote from a Sayuai chief, which is in the South, culture in the South Pacific. This goes back some decades. Hiding in your houses again, copulating day and night when there's work to be done. Why, if it were left up to you, you would spend the rest of your lives smelling yesterday's pig. But I tell you, yesterday's feast was nothing. The next one will be really big. So they're throwing feasts. The chief functions as a village cheerleader. And the saying among these villages where they have big men, these petty chiefs, is that the big man eats the stale cakes, meaning the big man has to work harder, has to function as a cheerleader, and does not get the kind of hereditary wealth that we have in our society. But they do have an important role, and they are, as we mentioned in talking about male supremacy, they have more social status, they tend to have multiple wives, but they don't get other accumulations of wealth. But we see that as the beginning of a process of social stratification that over time begins to affect child-rearing practices. So what you begin to see, particularly in the more larger tribes or tribes under more ecological duress, tribes that are more male supremacist, you see a structuring of child rearing, even among groups such as some of the Australian Aborigine groups, which were hunter-gatherers and lived at a very low density, but lived in a very sparse environment. So they were quite male supremacist and quite able and ready to do battle with other groups when necessary. They had a very structured child-rearing program, particularly with their male children. And of course, when you get the larger, more militarized, imperialistic male supremacist culture, the structuring becomes even more intensive. This is a picture from a boarding house, the kind of structuring and uniformity you would never see in a small village level or band level culture becomes the norm. And the question, how do you get from the innocence of childhood to ideological rigidity? It's not uncommon for extremist groups. The Khmer Rouge are one group that were in Cambodia, or Kampuchea as it was called for a while, that made use of very young child soldiers because they found that by putting them in very structured groups, very rigidly controlled groups, they could create a rigid obedience to what we would call an extremist ideology, a very inhumane ideology. So there's an impact from extreme structuring. There's a malleability there that does not exist so much once people mature more. The basis of that malleability, I think, is in the cognitive destructures that I started to learn about, at least, through the work of Jean Piaget. He had an enormous impact on how I think. He's deceased now, but he worked very intensively. He's the grandfather of developmental psychology, kind of the Sigmund Freud of developmental psychology. There's a lot of, this particular chapter in the book has a lot of academic quotes, which I'm not going to read to you on the slideshow because that would get rather tedious. But you're welcome certainly to go get the book and look at those quotes yourself about the relationship of Piaget's theories and broader sociocultural impacts. I'm not the first one to notice that there might be some connection. Piaget wrote a lot of books. The ones I have up on the screen here: The Child's Conception of Movement and Speed, The Construction of Reality in the Child, Judgment and Reasoning in the Child, The Child's Conception of Space. The ones I have here in my lap from my bookshelf: The Origins of Intelligence in the Child, Instead of Education, The Child's Conception of the World, and that one right in the middle, The Moral Judgment of the Child, I have that one in my lap too. I had read a number of Piaget's books and got a general familiarity with his theory and then I came upon The Moral Judgment of the Child. This was when I myself was actually a teenager. This was a long time ago now for me. But I have to say, I may be the only one who had a spiritual experience reading Jean Piaget, because by the time I got to The Moral Judgment of the Child, something very profound shifted for me, and that was an understanding of the kind of systematic nature of manipulating childhood cognitive development. So let's talk about that a little more. So Piaget set up what he considered to be cognitive stages. Now other people came along after him and made much more simplified and rigid stages. I mean, Lawrence Kohlberg was one. And his theories are a pittance, a pale shadow of Piaget's himself. Piaget's writing, the stages themselves are, as one would expect them to be, are somewhat amorphous, and one blends into the other, and there's only a few. And inasmuch as you can take them as representational of different ways of thinking among children, they make some sense. The more rigid systems created by other authors I don't think make much sense. In any case, so very young children are very sensory motor oriented, pre-operational, 2 to 7 years old. That's children are working very concrete terms, concrete operational. Children are developing some understanding of the rules, but in a very of the rules of the world, the way things work in the world, but in a very what Piaget referred to as realism. We'll go through and explain what that means. And informal operations is the sort of more abstract thinking of adults. And Piaget, one of the fascinating things about his theory is that he believed that there was an intricate link between understanding of the physical world and social relations, that as children grow up, their relations with their peers, with other children, and with adults affects their understanding of the physical world, and their understanding of the physical world affects their understanding of the social world, that the two are inextricably linked. Piaget made some fascinating observations that with young children they often, here's just a simple conservation experiment as it's called, where children are shown 2 beakers of water that are clearly equal, and then one's put in a taller beaker. The child will say the taller beaker has more water, even though that's, to an adult, clearly not true. We kind of assume that our understanding of the physical world, our understanding of speed, our understanding of objects moving through the world, of the continuity of color between objects, of time and space, and just the basic physical construction of the world, we just kind of assume, oh yeah, of course, that's just how we perceive it. And what Piaget demonstrated, was that these things are actually constructed slowly, systematically over a child's upbringing. They have to learn all of these things that we consider very basic to reality, about different perspectives, about just how things move and exist in the physical world as well as in the social world. The mountain experiment is where you put a doll on the other side of a mountain, a toy mountain in this case, or a model mountain, and then ask the child what the doll sees. And the small children will fairly consistently say that they will say the doll sees what they see. They don't really grok that or understand the perspective of the doll looking at the other side of the mountain. Piaget used the word egocentrism, which I think is the more useful word, and the word I use in the book is centration, because egocentrism implies narcissism, and that's not what he was talking about. What he's talking about with centration or egocentrism is a lack of ability to differentiate oneself from others. And if you've worked with mentally ill people, it's that kind of childhood centrated mind is very often very manifest in mentally ill people. But in any case, it's not that children think of themselves as being prettier or smarter or more important. It's that they have not yet learned to differentiate themselves from others. They have a kind of seamless connection between themselves and other people, and they see themselves as kind of, they don't differentiate. They don't see the rest, other human beings, as being equal to themselves, as being separate human beings. They're kind of just an extension of their own internal process. So they experience the world as an extension of their own internal mental events functioning. And what has a powerful impact, the thing that has a powerful impact on the development and the breaking down of centration towards a more sophisticated adult thinking, is who's in charge. Piaget studied the game of marbles among children. He definitely was sexist in his work, which is, of course, I mean, he started this work back in the early 1900s, so it was not uncommon in that time. He studied male children more than female children, but he did study females some. And what he found with the game of marbles is that who's in charge has an enormous impact on how children think and how they develop cognitively. So with the game of marbles, when children are young and the older kids are ruling over them, they tend to have a very rigid understanding of the rules. And by the time the children become the masters of the game, and they are the ones ruling over the small children, then they develop a more sophisticated adult understanding of the rules. That, oh yeah, of course, we create these rules, we can change these rules, whereas the small children say, no, these rules are absolute, they can't be changed. because of centration, children tend to, they don't understand physical causality in the very world. They have a fairly natural tendency towards what both modern psychologists as well as Piaget would call magical thinking. Magical thinking is common among children, also common among adults under stress. So this is part of the reason that we mentioned the Khmer Rouge earlier. The reason groups can take advantage of small children is because that magical thinking, you can create an ideology and fairly easily give it a magical aura by communicating it from above. You are in charge of the game of marbles. You're handing these rules down to children, and the children think in kind of magical terms. They don't critically assess the rules themselves. You see a kind of reversion to this magical thinking when adults are placed under extreme duress. That's a psychological experiment that's been repeated many times over the years. There are other manifestations of centration, what Piaget called nominal realism. When can a persimmon be called anything other than a persimmon? For an adult, we could say, oh, well, we can make up another name for that fruit. Well, that's my favorite fruit. You could think up of another name, and if we all agreed to call it a different name, we could call it that name. For small children, they have trouble with that. They tend to think in more rigid terms often. That may be somewhat less true now than it was in Piaget's time, or children may grow out of it more quickly depending on their familial situation. But there have been quite a few cross-cultural studies of these issues, and there is at least some consistency. I think Pierre Dissonance was the name of a psychologist who did those studies quite a while ago now, looking at different cultures. So nominal realism is when a name is connected to a thing in an absolute sense. Moral realism are when rules and morals are interpreted as internal law instead of changeable by common agreement. Again, a manifestation of centration. If you don't differentiate yourself from others, if you see the world as being an extension of your own self, if you don't understand adults as being other humans, as being other actors in a process of creating rules, of creating names, of creating the social realm, then those things take on a kind of absolute character. So this highly structured child rearing process that happens in Western society essentially takes the centration of small children and selectively perpetuates it into adulthood. We have these very structured educational systems, and whatever child rearing systems tend to be much, much more structured than we historically or anthropologically, if you look at our deep history, our far history, very different than what we evolved, how we evolved. And even today, isn't it fascinating that even in a college classroom, there's still a teacher, the kids are still sitting in desks, the kids are still called kids even though they're in their 20s. In a hunting and gathering culture, these people would be considered fully adult. They would be making the rules rather than receiving them from on high. And the issue is here, of course, is not to argue with expertise. If there's somebody who has something to teach, then certainly it's wise to listen to them. The argument is rather, or the thing to notice is rather to question who's in charge of the university, who creates the basic social structure of the university. Because high schools, colleges, universities, even elementary schools, we just assume that, of course, the students don't create that. The administrators administrate and create the structure of it. Well, that is not accidental. Human cultures are very structured, systematic systems, if I may be redundant. Things like this don't happen by accident. There's a reason for it. And the reason is that we take the social institutions of society itself and we make them into things that are handled by gods, doctors, and presidents, basically very powerful people. And we take the things that we make money off of and we make them into toasters. In the social realm, every human culture knows what it chooses to know and does not know what it chooses to not know. So we segment reality. We do that through this structured child rearing program. On the one hand, we have the money making. If you can make a better toaster and sell it, great. If you are a doctor and you can make a better medicine, sell it, great. We segment things. We do not give the student in the university control over the social realm because we do not want them to feel like they are that much in charge. We want to limit their social involvement. And here again, that's that by itself is one particular perspective, a particular issue, if you want to call it that. But we go back to that. Human cultures are very structured, and Complementary technologies, a development of an understanding of human cultural evolution would require us to critically analyze not just toasters, but every aspect of our social reality. And we are systematically taught not to do that. It's not an accident. And you see that particularly when you start looking at the alternatives. Childrearing. This is Summerhill, which is a school quite famous, and still is in England, where the children were in charge. Even at a very young age, children sat in a circle, and when there was a disciplinary issue or just any problem in the school, children had a vote, teachers had a vote, people worked things out. And certainly by the university age, why should people not be doing this? Well, they don't do it because we need to or choose to maintain the hierarchy. That which unifies makes us strong, that which unifies makes us blind. We are choosing to unify ourselves by segmenting our reality, by choosing to not understand our social realm, by choosing to partition our social realm. In its crudest form, it becomes this kind of God and country reality that there are certain pieces of most people's mind that they just don't think about critically, certain pieces of people's social reality, and that's not ideology. It is a cognitive manipulation. It is a manipulation of how people think. There's a systematic process coming up through our childhood that we are taught to not think about our own social structures around us the way we think about toasters or automobiles or lawnmowers or any of the other mechanical things we deal with. And various people deal with various things, of course, but we have a very systematic process of not allowing children to be in charge of social systems. Because if they were in charge of social systems, it would kick their cognitive development in the direction of thinking critically about their systems, or at least rationally. And that we choose not to do as a culture. Who's in charge has an enormous impact. This is a graduating picture from a class of an alternative high school that I taught at. And as you can see, they chose to be quite creative with it. This is a very small school. And again, this one was not quite as student-oriented or student-run as Summerhill. And there's a lot of different variations on childrearing and how people do things. But if we're going to live in a sustainable world, we have to understand our own human culture. We have to. And the only way we can do that is to push childhood cognitive development in the way of a positive understanding, or a rational understanding and a rational understanding of our own human culture. And the way you do that is by integrating children and putting them in charge of their own social systems. Just like the kids who are in charge of the game of marbles have a critical understanding or rational understanding of the game of marbles, the game of life, the game of social structures. We systematically disempower, and to save ourselves from our own stupidity, we are going to have to systematically empower children. So that's a quick overview. The chapter in the book actually goes into quite a bit more depth into these issues. But that should give you some idea, if you're interested, in that chapter. We can put people on the moon, and we can't save ourselves from our own foolish decisions. We're choosing to not save ourselves. And at this point, social movements are never built all at once. We simply need a critical mass of people to start developing a conscious culture, and to identify it as a conscious culture, to have a clear understanding of this is what we're doing. We're developing a conscious culture that is sustainable, that can critically and rationally and thoughtfully assess our history, our future. And childrearing is a critical part of that. So thank you very much. Have a good day. Look forward to the next chapter.